The Interstellar Geological Survey had been mapping backwater planets for 3 centuries, and in all that time, they had never once lost a camp to weather. Weather, after all, was a solved problem. Any species advanced enough to leave their home system had long ago figured out how to predict atmospheric conditions down to the millisecond and protect themselves with energy barriers that could withstand anything short of a supernova. The fact that planet Ketharis 7 was currently in the process of making absolute fools of them all was therefore somewhat embarrassing. The expedition consisted of 5 members, each representing the cream of their respective species' scientific community. There was Vex, a Thaloxian, whose crystalline body refracted light in ways that suggested he was perpetually judging everyone around him, which he absolutely was. Beside him stood Korath, a gelmech who resembled a 6-limbed bear, covered in bioluminescent fur that pulsed with his mood, currently a smug amber. The team's environmental specialist, Quillix, belonged to a species that had evolved in gas giants and wore a containment suit that made them look like a floating jellyfish having an identity crisis. Their medical officer, Dren, was a Potrix with skin like polished obsidian and enough advanced degrees to fill a small library. And then there was the human. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been added to the expedition at the last possible moment when their original xenobotanist had contracted a rather spectacular case of Rigelian flu. The Interstellar Geological Survey had reluctantly accepted Earth's offer of a replacement, though the general consensus was that humans were a recent addition to the galactic community who still did things like camping for fun and climbing mountains without anti-gravity assistance. Quaint, really. Adorably primitive. The camp they had established in Ketharis 7's northern temperate zone was a masterpiece of modern expedition technology. Force field generators created invisible domes that regulated temperature, deflected precipitation, and filtered out harmful radiation. Climate sensors networked across 50 square kilometers, feeding real-time data into predictive algorithms that could forecast weather patterns 6 weeks in advance. Their habitat modules were constructed from smart matter that could reconfigure itself based on environmental needs, and the whole setup was powered by quantum batteries that could run for a decade without recharging. Marcus had looked at all of it, nodded politely, and then spent his first 3 days quietly observing the local vegetation and soil composition. The others had found this hilarious. "Look at him," Vex had said, his crystalline voice tinkling with amusement as Marcus crouched near a cluster of thick-trunked trees. "He is examining dirt with his actual hands. His species does have a strong attachment to tactile learning," Quillix had observed, their translator rendering their gas whispers into condescending standard galactic. "They only achieved faster-than-light travel 2 centuries ago. Give them time." Marcus had ignored them, as he had learned to ignore most of the expedition's commentary on human inadequacy. He was too busy noticing that the trees here had root systems that spread horizontally rather than vertically, and that their bark had a peculiar flexibility to it. Interesting. The storm warning came on day 7. Korath's fur shifted from amber to a concerned yellow as he reviewed the atmospheric data. "We have a significant weather system approaching. It will arrive in approximately 6 hours. Severity?" Dren asked, not looking up from the geological samples he was cataloguing. "The sensors indicate sustained winds of 140 kilometers per hour, with gusts potentially exceeding 200. Precipitation levels will be extreme." Korath paused. "The system is also moving faster than our models predicted. It has accelerated by 37% in the last hour." Vex made a sound like wind chimes dismissing a concern. "The force fields are rated for winds triple that velocity. We have nothing to worry about." The prediction models have been consistently inaccurate since we arrived, Marcus said quietly. He was standing at the edge of the camp, looking at the sky. The clouds on the horizon were building vertically at an unnatural rate, towers of grey and black that seemed to be boiling upward. This planet's atmospheric chemistry might be interfering with the sensors. Atmospheric chemistry is accounted for in our algorithms, Quillix said, somehow managing to sound patronizing despite being a floating gas creature. We have surveyed over 8,000 worlds. I assure you, the force fields will hold. Marcus turned to look at the alien scientists, then back at the approaching storm. Right, I'm going to gather some materials, just in case. Materials? Korath's fur flickered with confusion. What materials? Vines, branches, leaves, things like that. The laughter that followed was polite but unmistakable. Dren's obsidian features arranged themselves into what his species considered a kindly expression. Marcus, I appreciate your instincts, but we are not in danger. Perhaps this is a good opportunity for you to observe how advanced civilizations handle environmental challenges. Sure, Marcus said. I'll observe, from over there, while I gather some vines. He walked toward the tree line, and behind him he heard Vex mutter something about humans and their adorable survival instincts from their cave-dwelling days. Marcus had heard variations of this joke approximately 50 times since joining the expedition. It had stopped being annoying and had circled back around to being almost funny. He spent the next 3 hours collecting materials. The vines he had noticed earlier were perfect, thick and flexible, with a fibrous interior that made them incredibly strong. The trees shed branches regularly, and he found several with the right combination of weight and flexibility. He also collected broad leaves from a plant that resembled a palm tree, and began carrying everything back toward camp. The storm hit in hour 4. It did not arrive gradually. One moment, the wind was a steady 30 kilometers per hour. The next, it was a screaming wall of force that bent the trees nearly horizontal. The rain came not in drops but in sheets, as if someone had simply tipped the ocean sideways and decided to pour it over this specific patch of planet. The force fields held for approximately 90 seconds. Then, with a sound like reality hiccuping, they failed. The failure was not partial, it was not graceful. The entire network of generators simply stopped functioning simultaneously, and the invisible protective domes vanished as if they had never existed. The wind hit the habitat modules with the force of a vengeful deity, and the smart matter that was supposed to reconfigure itself to handle stress did something it had apparently never been programmed to do. It panicked. The structures began shifting frantically, rippling and warping as their algorithms tried and failed to find a stable configuration. Within 30 seconds, 2 of the 3 modules had collapsed into puddles of expensive technology, having an existential crisis. Korath's fur went pure white with alarm. The generators are not responding. The quantum batteries show full charge but no output. The atmospheric composition. Quillix's voice was barely audible over the wind. I am detecting ionic compounds that should not exist in this concentration. They are creating electromagnetic interference across the entire spectrum. Our technology is useless. The 3rd module, Dren shouted, pointing at the last standing structure. The team ran toward it, but they were too slow. A gust of wind that had to be pushing 250 kilometers per hour caught it sideways, and the smart matter made one final, desperate attempt to reconfigure before giving up entirely. The module crumpled like paper and tumbled away into the grey chaos of the storm. They stood in the screaming wind and pounding rain, 5 highly educated scientists representing some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, completely helpless. Marcus appeared out of the storm, carrying an armful of vines. His hair was plastered to his head, and water was streaming down his face, but his expression was one of intense focus rather than panic. He had to shout to be heard over the wind. "Follow me. There's a slight depression in the ground about 50 meters that way. It will give us some protection from the wind." Protection? Vex's crystalline body was vibrating dangerously in the wind. "We need the emergency beacon. We need evacuation. The beacon runs on the same quantum batteries as everything else," Marcus shouted back. "If the electromagnetic interference is shutting down quantum field interactions, nothing we brought is going to work. Move." The human turned and started walking into the storm, and after a moment of shocked hesitation, the others followed. They had no other options. The depression Marcus had mentioned was barely worthy of the name, just a slight dip in the terrain where water was already pooling, but it did reduce the wind from catastrophic to merely terrible. Marcus dropped his bundle of vines and branches and immediately turned back toward the trees. "Where are you going?" Dren called after him. "Getting more materials. We need shelter." In this, Korath's voice was nearly lost in the wind. "You will be killed." Marcus was already disappearing into the rain. His voice came back faint but determined. "Then I guess I'll die doing something useful instead of standing around discussing how impossible it is." He returned 4 times, each trip bringing more vines, branches and leaves. By the 3rd trip, Quillix quietly joined him, their containment suit proving surprisingly effective at grabbing and carrying materials. By the 4th trip, even Vex had stopped complaining and started helping, though his crystalline body was poorly suited for manual labor. Marcus worked with a speed and certainty that suggested he had done this before, which the others would learn later he had. Childhood summers in rural North America, a brief stint in wilderness survival training, and a memorable 3 months backpacking through regions of Earth that had no name because they were deliberately kept isolated from modern technology. Skills that the galactic community considered quaint relics of primitive development were now the only things standing between the expedition and a very wet, very windy death. He selected the 4 thickest branches and drove them into the ground at angles, creating a rectangular frame roughly 3 meters by 4 meters. The soft ground, saturated with rain, accepted the branches easily. Then he began the process of weaving. The vines went horizontally between the vertical supports, over and under, creating a lattice. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite the cold and wet, tying knots that would hold under tension. The other expedition members watched in fascination as something recognizable began to take shape. More branches were laid across the top, creating a roof frame, and Marcus began layering the broad leaves over it in overlapping rows, like scales or roof tiles. "The angle of the leaves directs water away from the interior," he explained, having to shout over the storm. "Each layer overlaps the one below it. Basic waterproofing. Humans figured this out about 50,000 years ago." 50,000, Dren repeated, stunned. "Your species was doing this for 50,000 years. Probably longer," Marcus said, weaving more vines through the wall lattice. "Archaeological record only goes back so far. Hand me those smaller branches." The walls took shape with agonizing slowness. Each vine had to be woven through carefully, each knot tied securely. Marcus's hands were shaking with cold and exhaustion, but he did not stop. Korath tried to help with the weaving and discovered that his 6-limbed body, so well suited for laboratory work, was almost useless for this kind of precise manual task. Dren had better luck, his obsidian fingers proving surprisingly dexterous once Marcus showed him the pattern. The storm raged around them with undiminished fury. Lightning began striking in the distance, great forks of electric blue that illuminated the apocalyptic landscape for split seconds at a time. The wind shifted directions chaotically, and twice Marcus had to stop and reinforce sections of the shelter that were taking too much stress. 2 hours into construction, Vex made an observation. "This is insane. We are building a structure using plants. We are scientists representing civilizations that have conquered faster than light travel, and we are weaving vines." Marcus, coating sections of the wall with mud to fill gaps and add structural integrity, glanced at the crystalline alien. "And yet, we're not standing in the open wishing our quantum batteries worked, are we?" Vex fell silent. The shelter was not pretty. It was not elegant. It looked like exactly what it was, a desperate construction made from whatever materials were available by someone working against time and elements. The walls were uneven, the roof sagged in the middle, and mud was oozing between gaps in ways that suggested the waterproofing was more theoretical than actual. But as Marcus tied off the final vine and reinforced the entrance with a woven flap, it was also standing. The wind pushed against it, the rain hammered down on it, and it held. "Inside," Marcus said. "Now." They crawled through the entrance one by one. The interior was cramped, barely large enough for 5 beings of various sizes and shapes. Water was dripping through several spots in the roof, but it was dripping, not pouring. The wind still howled outside, but inside the shelter it was reduced to a muted roar. The temperature was perhaps 2 degrees warmer than outside, which did not sound like much until one had been standing in freezing rain for 3 hours. They sat in the darkness, listening to the storm rage. Quilix's bioluminescence provided faint light, and in that dim glow they could see each other's faces. Dren's obsidian features were unreadable as always, but his posture suggested exhaustion. Korath's fur had settled into a deep blue that indicated profound discomfort. Vex's crystalline body had stopped refracting light in complex patterns and was now just barely glowing. And Marcus sat with his back against the woven wall, breathing hard, looking like he might fall asleep at any moment. "You saved our lives," Quilix said quietly. "With vines and mud." "Don't thank me yet," Marcus replied. "We still need to survive until the storm passes, and then figure out how to signal for rescue without any working technology. But yeah, we're not dead right now, which is a good start." "How did you know to do this?" Korath asked. "Where did you learn this?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Earth has a lot of places where technology doesn't work very well. Regions with strong magnetic fields, areas with unusual atmospheric conditions, places where it's just easier to do things the old way. And before we had technology, we had to survive anyway. Every human culture developed variations of emergency shelter construction. This is just a basic version." He looked around at the aliens surrounding him. "My people have been surviving on hostile planets for our entire evolutionary history. We just called it Tuesday." The night stretched on. The storm did not diminish. At some point, Dren discovered that his medical scanner, which ran on chemical batteries rather than quantum systems, still functioned. He checked everyone for hypothermia and found that while they were all cold and miserable, no one was in immediate medical danger. The shelter, crude as it was keeping them alive. Around what Marcus estimated was midnight, Vex spoke into the darkness. "I apologize." "For what?" Marcus asked. "For dismissing your capabilities, for treating human methods as primitive and irrelevant, for assuming that technological advancement negates the value of fundamental skills." The crystalline alien's voice had lost all its earlier condescension. "You tried to warn us, you prepared while we mocked you, and when everything failed, you built this shelter while we stood around being useless." "We weren't useless," Marcus said. You all helped carry materials. Dren helped with the weaving. Quillix's containment suit was actually perfect for gathering branches. This was a team effort. You are being generous, Quillix said. We contributed because you directed us. Without your knowledge, we would have died in that storm, and our last thoughts would have been confusion about why our technology had failed us. Marcus shifted against the wall, trying to find a position that didn't have water dripping directly on him. Your technology didn't fail you. It encountered conditions it wasn't designed for. That happens. The problem wasn't the technology. It was assuming technology would solve everything and not having a backup plan that didn't require it. He paused. Also, your sensors really should have caught those ionic compounds earlier. That's going to be an awkward report to file. Despite everything, Korath made a sound that might have been a laugh. If we survive to file it. When, Marcus corrected. When we survive to file it. The storm can't last forever. Tomorrow morning, we'll assess the situation, salvage what we can from the camp, and figure out how to build a signal fire big enough to be seen from orbit. A signal fire, Vex repeated. Using combustion to communicate across space. You have a better idea that doesn't require quantum batteries? Marcus asked. Silence. Signal fire it is. Marcus said. They sat in the shelter as the hours crawled past. The storm continued its assault on the planet, but inside their woven walls they were alive. Cold, wet, uncomfortable, but alive. Somewhere in the early morning hours, despite the discomfort, they began to doze. Even Vex, whose species did not technically sleep, entered a low-power meditative state. Marcus took the first watch, though watch for what? He was not certain. He sat listening to the storm and thinking about how the universe had a sense of humor. Humanity had spent 2 centuries trying to prove they belonged among the galactic community, building faster ships, developing better technology, demonstrating their scientific capabilities. And in the end, what had saved this expedition was knowledge that predated written language. Dawn came gradually, the darkness fading to gray. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, and the wind had dropped to levels that were merely annoying rather than life-threatening. Marcus carefully unwove the entrance flap and crawled outside. The devastation was comprehensive. Where their high-tech camp had stood, there was now just wreckage. Smart matter had hardened into irregular lumps scattered across the landscape. Force field generators lay half-buried in mud, their quantum batteries inert and useless. Equipment that had cost more than most planets' annual budgets was now expensive trash, and in the slight depression in the ground, built from vines and branches and mud, the humans' shelter stood intact. The other expedition members emerged one by one, staring at the destruction of everything they had brought and the survival of what they had built. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Dren broke the silence. Our entire scientific approach to this planet will need to be revised. We made assumptions about our technological superiority that proved catastrophically wrong. Not wrong, Marcus said, surveying the wreckage. Just incomplete. Technology is amazing when it works, but it's good to have skills that don't require batteries. He turned to face the group. Now, who wants to help me build a really big fire? We've got a rescue to signal for, and I'm pretty sure burning wet wood creates more smoke, which is exactly what we want. Quillix made a sound that their translator rendered as philosophical resignation. I am a scientist who has published 43 papers on atmospheric composition, and I am about to spend my morning learning to make fire from sticks. Rocks, actually, Marcus corrected. The sticks are too wet. We'll need to find flint or something similar. And dry tinder, which is going to be fun after last night's rain. This is going to take a while. Of course it is, Vex said, but there was no sarcasm in his chiming voice anymore, just weary acceptance. They spent the day working on the signal fire. Marcus taught them how to find dry material in the centers of fallen logs, how to create a proper fire structure that would burn hot and produce maximum smoke, how to use rocks to create sparks. It took 6 hours and multiple failures before they had flames, and when the fire finally caught, the cheer that went up from the expedition was entirely genuine. The rescue ship spotted their smoke 2 days later. When the recovery team arrived, they found 5 expedition members living in a woven shelter next to a massive signal fire, looking exhausted and muddy but very much alive. The rescue team's captain, a Thaloxian like Vex, surveyed the scene with undisguised confusion. "Where is your camp?" the captain asked. Vex gestured at the scattered wreckage. "That was our camp. The electromagnetic interference from the planet's unique atmospheric conditions disabled all our quantum-based technology. We survived using primitive construction techniques." Primitive, Marcus corrected, is a relative term. I prefer time-tested. The captain's crystalline body refracted light in a pattern that suggested profound disbelief. "You built that shelter using manual labor." "The human built it," Korath said, his fur pulsing with an emotion his species reserved for deep respect. "We merely assisted. He saved our lives with knowledge that his species has maintained for thousands of generations." The rescue proceeded efficiently, and the expedition members were transported back to the survey ship in orbit. The medical bay cleared them all as healthy, if somewhat traumatized. Debriefings were conducted, reports were filed, and slowly word spread through the Interstellar Geological Survey about what had happened on Ketharis 7. 6 months later, the survey updated their standard expedition protocols. New requirements were added. Teams must now include at least 1 member trained in non-technological survival methods. Equipment loadouts must include basic manual tools. And most significantly, expedition leaders were required to attend a 2-week course on primitive survival techniques. The course was taught by humans, naturally. Marcus returned to Earth after his expedition term ended, carrying with him letters of recommendation from 4 alien scientists who had learned an important lesson about the difference between advancement and replacement. Technology could fail. Environments could surprise you, but knowledge, skills refined over thousands of generations of survival, those were tools that needed no batteries and broke no laws of physics. The universe, it turned out, had room for both quantum field generators and woven vine shelters. The truly advanced civilizations were the ones that understood when to use which. And if you ever found yourself on a hostile planet in a catastrophic storm with all your technology dead, you really wanted a human on your team, preferably one who knew how to tie good knots. Because at the end of the day, surviving the universe required more than just advanced technology. It required the stubborn, adaptable, occasionally absurd determination to keep going when everything fell apart. It required the willingness to get your hands dirty, to work with whatever materials you had, to build solutions out of mud and vines when your quantum batteries decided to take an unscheduled vacation. Humanity had been doing that for hundreds of thousands of years. The rest of the galaxy was still catching up.